Every great empire has its secret fuel. For Britain, it wasn't just coal in the boilers or oak in the shipyards. It was something far more ordinary, something that still sits quietly on kitchen tables and office desks today. By the mid-1700s, tea imports alone were bringing in a staggering share of Britain's tax revenue. Add sugar to the tea, and you get one of the most lucrative revenue streams in the empire, a daily ritual quietly pouring money into the treasury. Those tea and sugar monies helped supply the Royal Navy, feeding sailors, provisioning ships, and paying for the dockyards that turned timber into warships. And that fleet, in turn, protected the very trade routes that brought in more tea, more sugar, and more taxes. It was a loop, a circle. You drank your sweetened tea in London, Liverpool, or Manchester. And somewhere far away, a warship stayed at sea one more month. Tea, sugar, and a mountain of debt. That's the paradox. How did a drink you might casually sip at your desk, sweetened with a spoonful of sugar, help pay for the most powerful navy on Earth through an IOU system that was never really meant to be repaid? This is where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is as simple as it looks. British naval power wasn't just built in dockyards. It was built in counting houses, customs offices, and the quiet machinery of public finance. From the 1690s onward, Parliament poured unprecedented sums into the Royal Navy, turning it into the muscle behind Britain's expanding mercantile empire. But that muscle was expensive. Wooden walls cost money, cannons cost money, sailors, victuals, rope, tar, repairs, and prize courts all demanded a constant stream of cash. So the British state leaned on three pillars to pay for it: everyday consumption, global trade, and perpetual debt. Everyday consumption meant tea and sugar on millions of tables. Global trade meant the convoys and merchant fleets crossing oceans with cargoes that could be taxed. Perpetual debt meant a national IOU system centered on the Bank of England, a way of pulling future income into the present. Together, these pillars created a feedback loop that turned a simple cup of sweetened tea into naval supremacy. To see how that worked, it helps to go back to the beginning, to the moment Britain figured out how to tax taste and sell the future at interest. By the 18th century, tea sweetened with sugar had become the energy drink of the British working day. Cheap tea gave workers a hit of caffeine, sugar piled on cheap calories. Warm, sweet tea turned a piece of bread into a meal and kept people going through 12 or 14, even 16-hour days. It was an affordable luxury, just accessible enough that even modest households could consume it regularly. That was the point. It felt like comfort. It functioned like infrastructure, because every cup was taxed. The tea itself paid duties the moment it entered a British port. The sugar dumped into it carried its own duties, carefully structured and adjusted by Parliament. The more people drank, the more the state earned. Tea became not just a drink, but a pipeline. By the mid-1700s, tea alone was responsible for a remarkable slice of Britain's total tax income. Sugar was not far behind. In the 19th century, sugar duties brought in millions of pounds a year, serious money in a world where a laborer might earn a few shillings a week. The British state had discovered a gold mine hidden in a teapot. You don't need to seize land at sword point if you can quietly tax the things people reach for without thinking. You don't need to confiscate wealth openly if you can skim a fraction off every comforting sip. That was the first lesson. You don't have to tax people's land to fund an empire. You can tax their habits. The genius, or the brutality, of Britain's fiscal system was simple. Tax things people want. Make those things part of their identity. Then use the revenue to pay for the machinery that keeps the system going. Tea quickly became a symbol of Britishness, a daily ritual of respectability and calm. Sugar made it more addictive, both chemically and culturally. The porcelain cup on the table wasn't just a vessel for hot liquid. It was a node in a vast network of plantations, ports, insurers, merchants, and tax collectors. Behind the cozy image of a domestic tea table was a highly efficient tax pipeline. Import duties on tea, collected at British ports. Duties on sugar, much of it from Caribbean plantations. An army of customs officials and excise officers backed by legal penalties and naval enforcement. Even in North America, when London tried to raise revenue after the 7 Years' War, it reached for the same levers: sugar and tea. The Sugar Act and later tea duties were attempts to pull more money from colonial consumption into imperial coffers. Colonists saw intrusion and arbitrary control. The British government saw continuity. This was simply how the empire paid its bills. Tea in the cup, sugar on the spoon, gun ports on the horizon. None of this mattered, of course, if Britain couldn't control the sea. From the late 17th century onward, successive governments made a strategic decision. If you control the oceans, you control the trade. If you control the trade, you control the wealth. The Royal Navy became the sharp edge of that strategy. Warships guarded convoys bringing sugar from the Caribbean. They protected East Indiamen hauling tea from the Indian Ocean and China. They patrolled choke points like the Straits of Gibraltar and the approaches to the Channel. They blockaded rival ports and escorted British shipping. This floating wall of wood and gunpowder was the insurance policy for Britain's entire mercantile system. It was not cheap. The 18th century was a near-continuous series of conflicts. The War of the Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, and later the long Napoleonic struggle. Military spending, and particularly naval spending, consumed staggering portions of the government's budget. The state needed cash, and it needed it quickly. Here is where the story shifts from teapots and sugar bowls to ledgers and IOUs. In 1694, faced with the crushing cost of war against France, the English state tried something radical. It chartered a new institution, the Bank of England. Investors contributed capital to the bank. In return, the bank lent most of that capital to the government, which used it to fund war. The loan was to be repaid over time with interest, serviced by future tax receipts. Instead of raising every penny in the present through taxes, the state could tap the wealth of future years. That decision changed the trajectory of Britain's power. It turned the Crown and Parliament into what historians call a fiscal military state, a government with the capacity to borrow enormous sums, backed by a reliable tax base, and dedicated to long-term military competition on a global scale. Over the 18th century, Britain's national debt ballooned. It was not a sign of mismanagement. It was the side effect of a new kind of weapon. This debt was tradable. You didn't just lend to the state and wait. You received government bonds, annuities, or other instruments you could sell on the market. The more reliable the state's tax base, the safer those bonds looked. And a significant part of that tax base came from everyday consumption. Tea and sugar, tobacco and spirits. 1,000 small indulgences turned into revenue streams. The British Navy, in other words, sailed on a sea of IOUs. If you zoom out, a loop comes into focus. Workers drink tea sweetened with sugar. That habit keeps them working longer and harder for low wages. The state taxes that tea and sugar whenever it crosses a border. Those taxes form a dependable stream of income, and the government then issues debt, promising to pay interest out of that income. Investors hand over capital in exchange for those promises. The state spends heavily on the Royal Navy, funding ships, sailors, victuals, repairs, and dockyard infrastructure. The Navy patrols and protects the trade routes that bring in more tea and sugar. Trade grows, consumption grows, tax revenue grows, and the loop tightens. Viewed from this angle, British naval power looks less like a purely military achievement and more like the visible top of an economic machine. At the base of the machine sits sugar and tea, daily comforts turned into dependable cash. In the middle sits debt, a lattice of promises connecting the state to investors. At the top sit the gun decks, the ships of the line, the frigates and sloops that carried the Union Jack to every ocean. Every spoonful of sugar in a London kitchen was, in a very small way, a payment towards Britain's command of the sea. The empire was running on a caffeine and calorie tax. But there is another layer, darker and harder to ignore. That sugar in the tea did not fall from the sky. It came from plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas, systems built on enslaved African labor and brutal exploitation. Fields of cane were cleared and planted under the sun by people who owned nothing, not even themselves. Harvesting sugar was dangerous, exhausting, and lethal. Mills crushed cane into pulp and crushed bodies with equal indifference. Plantation owners shipped sugar back to Britain, insured by London firms and financed by British credit. The British state did not just tax sugar, it shaped the global sugar economy. Duties favored sugar from British colonies over rival producers, protecting planters, and keeping the imperial sugar circuit profitable. Later reforms tinkered with those duties, but only after generations in which imperial policy and plantation slavery were tightly interwoven. Wealth flowed to London, Bristol, Liverpool, and other ports. That wealth supported the credit of the British state. A solvent, tax-rich government could borrow cheaply. Cheap borrowing meant more ships, more guns, more naval bases, more wars fought to protect trade and secure more markets. When you see a 19th century line of battleship in a painting, you are seeing timber, iron, rope, tar, and sailcloth. But you're also seeing sugar fields in Jamaica and Barbados, tea plantations in India and Ceylon, and ledger books in the city of London. The ship is the hardware. The real operating system is finance, trade, and exploitation. Not everyone in the empire accepted this arrangement quietly. At the edges of Britain's world, taxation of taste and habit collided with politics. In North America, the attempt to apply the same revenue logic used at home met a different response. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later tea duties were meant to help pay down the debts of empire, particularly those incurred in defending the colonies. From London's perspective, this was rational. The empire had bled money. Colonial trade had flourished under British protection. Therefore, colonial consumption could be tapped to help balance the books. Colonists saw something else entirely. They saw external taxes imposed by a distant legislature in which they had no representation. They saw ordinary goods, sugar, molasses, tea, turned into symbols of subordination. Their daily consumption was being used to pay for a navy and an empire they didn't control. When they threw chests of tea into Boston Harbor, they weren't just protesting a beverage. They were revolting against a system in which their morning drink quietly funded someone else's decisions, someone else's wars, someone else's debt. There is a pattern here. People will tolerate hidden taxation, at least for a time, as long as the strings remain invisible. When the strings show, when the link between the kettle on the hearth and the cannon on the horizon becomes too obvious, the illusion frays. By the time Britain entered the titanic struggle of the Napoleonic Wars, its national debt was enormous by the standards of the age, yet that crushing weight became a source of strength. Britain could borrow on a scale that rival powers could not match. Investors across Europe and beyond trusted that the British state, backed by a broad and growing tax base, would honor its obligations. Tea and sugar duties were just part of a much larger fiscal system that included income taxes, excises, and customs, but they had helped build the habits and the administrative machinery that made large-scale taxation possible. Debt had become the invisible hull of the Royal Navy. You could not see it on a ship's side, but it was there all the same. Each plank and cannon was financed not just by present taxes, but by the confidence of bondholders who believed in the state's future ability to tax. Every broadside at Trafalgar carried with it an echo of London's coffee houses, counting rooms, and tea tables, where investors traded government securities and households consumed taxed imports. Tea and sugar taxes helped make the interest payments that kept those investors calm. Calm investors kept the credit flowing. Credit kept the shipyards busy and the fleets at sea. And the fleets, in turn, protected the empire that ensured more tea, more sugar, more trade, and more taxes. Debt, in theory, meant obligation. In practice, it became leverage. The British state used it to stretch time, to pay for wars now with money that would be collected later. So what should survive in the mind when the kettle cools and the story ends? Several lessons cross the centuries. Empires prefer to tax what people will not stop buying, even if they grumble. In the 18th century, that was tea and sugar. Today, it might be fuel, alcohol, cigarettes, soft drinks, digital services, or your daily coffee. The underlying logic is unchanged. Turn habits into revenue streams, desires into fiscal infrastructure. Military power is rarely paid for in a straightforward, transparent way. The Royal Navy was not funded by a neat, single line on a budget. It was the end result of a consumption-driven tax base, a sophisticated debt market, and institutions that could transform tomorrow's taxes into today's firepower. Modern states still do this. They borrow heavily, spend on defense, and trust that future taxpayers will quietly service the interest. The human cost is often invisible to those enjoying their comforts. For 18th century Britons, sweet tea was warmth and stability. For enslaved workers in the Caribbean, sugar was a chain. Systems that feel normal on the consumption end can be catastrophic at the production end. The comfort in one place can be built on coercion somewhere else. And debt, finally, is more than a number on a spreadsheet. It is a map of power. It shows who owes whom, on what terms, and with whose labor the interest will be paid. In Britain's case, it shows how everyday drinkers helped fund a global navy, how investors turned state IOUs into private wealth, and how the state turned consumption and credit into geopolitical dominance. When people say that British naval power ruled the waves, they are telling only the last chapter of a much longer story. Behind the oak hulls and iron guns was a more fragile architecture. Porcelain cups, sugar bowls, customs houses, and bond markets. The empire's steel spine was bolted onto a nation's sweet tooth and a ledger of perpetual debt. The next time you stir sugar into a hot drink, remember that once upon a time, that simple act would have been part of a global machine. A machine that paid for sails and cannon, that guarded convoys and blockaded enemies, that redrew the map of the world. And remember, too, the pattern beneath it. Ordinary habits, quietly taxed, distant costs, quietly ignored, and a web of promises, rolled over year after year, designed not to be broken, but to be believed in. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and there's always more to see if you know where to look.